Well, good morning, everyone. This is Friday, Good Friday, April 2nd, 2021. My name is Jake Forsyth, and I'm the Ministry Program Director here at Summit Church in Durango, Colorado. And it is an absolutely beautiful morning outside, and I can't wait to get out there and experience some nice weather this weekend. I don't know about you, but I'm ready to be outside in some shorts and a t-shirt and to spend time outdoors after as we move into spring this season. So we always share our glory sightings of where we've experienced God's glory lately, and on Fridays we also talk about hope encounters of where have you experienced hope, or where have others in your life brought you hope lately. And so if you have things like that to share, please do so in the chat box. For me, the weather. I'm an outdoor type of person, so being able to get outside and experience some warm weather and some sunshine is always good for my soul. So that's a glory sighting for me. Just having some warmer temperatures this weekend is going to be great. And then also today is my parents' 50th anniversary. So happy anniversary, Mom and Dad, and love you guys, and hope you have a wonderful day today. So that's my glory sightings for today. We are going to be reading out of Mark's Gospel again as we wrap up our Lent study. And this weekend will be obviously our Easter services. So hope those of you who have already signed up to join us for one of the services in person will have a blessed time there. If you haven't done that, we also have online opportunities. Pretty much we are filled up to capacity for most of our services. But anyhow, I hope you all have a blessed Easter weekend. But we are going to be wrapping up our Lent study in Mark's Gospel, starting in Mark chapter 14, verse 66, and we're going to read through Mark 15:15. And I have a Bible study of men who we meet every Friday morning. So we spent some time in this passage earlier this morning, and that was a really good discussion as well. But I'll read through this, and we'll talk about it a bit. So we're starting with Mark 14, verse 66. It says, "Meanwhile, Peter was in the courtyard below. One of the servant girls who worked for the high priest came by and noticed Peter warming himself at the fire. She looked at him closely and said, 'You were one of those with Jesus of Nazareth.' But Peter denied it. 'I don't know what you're talking about,' he said, and he went out into the entryway. Just then a rooster crowed. When the servant girl saw him standing there, she began telling the others, 'This man is definitely one of them.' But Peter denied it again. A little later, some of the other bystanders confronted Peter and said, 'You must be one of them, because you're a Galilean.' Peter swore, 'A curse on me if I'm lying. I don't know this man you're talking about.' And immediately the rooster crowed a second time. Suddenly, Jesus' words flashed through Peter's mind. 'Before the rooster crows twice, you will deny 3 times that you even knew me.' And he broke down and wept. Very early in the morning, the leading priests and elders and the teachers of religious law, the entire council, met to discuss their next step. They bound Jesus, led him away, and took him to Pilate, the Roman governor. Pilate asked Jesus, 'Are you the king of the Jews?' Jesus replied, 'You have said it.' Then the leading priests kept accusing him of many crimes, and Pilate asked him, 'Aren't you going to answer them? What about all these charges they are bringing against you?' But Jesus said nothing, much to Pilate's surprise. Now it was the governor's custom each year during the Passover celebration to release one prisoner, anyone the people requested. One of the prisoners at that time was Barabbas, a revolutionary who had committed murder in an uprising. The crowd went to Pilate and asked him to release a prisoner as usual. 'Would you like me to release to you this king of the Jews?' Pilate asked. for he realized by now that the leading priest had arrested Jesus out of envy. But at this point, the leading priest stirred up the crowd to demand the release of Barabbas instead of Jesus. Pilate asked them, "Then what should I do with this man you call the King of the Jews?" They shouted back, "Crucify him." "Why?" Pilate demanded. "What crime has he committed?" But the mob roared even louder, "Crucify him." So to pacify the crowd, Pilate released Barabbas to them. He ordered Jesus flogged with a lead-tipped whip, then turned him over to the Roman soldiers to be crucified. So to start with, I wanted us to be reflecting on a question, and that is, can you put yourself in Peter's shoes in this passage? Imagine how Peter must have felt when he denied Jesus that third time and then immediately heard the rooster crow a second time. And he recalls this conversation that he had had with Jesus previously. That had to be in the lowest point of Peter's life, I would imagine. Peter was Jesus's closest friend, and yet he finds himself in this situation that Jesus predicted, even told Peter that this would happen. And so, as these memories rush back to him, as he denies Jesus that third time, and as the rooster crows the second time, Peter feels this unbelievable guilt and shame and fear of being linked with his closest friend and his Lord. So he denies him, and then there's nothing left to do but weep, as he reflects on all this, and as it kind of becomes reality for him. So can you put yourself in Peter's shoes there? That's my men's group this morning, we were talking about that, and how all of us would really hope that we would respond differently than Peter in that moment. But put in the same circumstance, would we? Or have we been put in similar circumstances where someone was ridiculing Christians, for example, and instead of saying, "Hey, I'm a Christian," we kind of cowered it down and didn't say anything, or even acted like we weren't, out of fear of persecution or whatever it might be. So can you put yourself in Peter's shoes in that moment, or have you been in Peter's shoes before, where you found yourself in a difficult situation where if you felt like if you claimed to be a follower of Jesus, something bad might happen to you? And the reality is that Peter was Jesus' closest friend, and so even if Jesus' closest friend is reacting that way, who are we to say we would do anything different, right? And then in the story, we move to this interesting part of the story, at least for me. Jesus goes on trial before Pontius Pilate, and instead of arguing and fighting for his life, he knows what the consequence is if he gets found guilty. And instead of fighting and arguing for his life and saying much at all, we find Jesus being very silent and reserved. He hardly even speaks, and Pilate even questions him, like, "Aren't you even going to defend yourself?" And Jesus doesn't. And that has always struck me as an interesting response from Jesus. I don't know about you, but as I reflected on it, I believe it's because Jesus knew his time had come for the cross, and he was completely surrendering his will to the Father's will in that moment. We find other times in Scripture where the crowds wanted Jesus killed, or even tried to kill Jesus themselves, and yet he slips away, right? But in this case, he's very silent, very reserved, and kind of has surrendered his will to the Father's, and knows that the cross is his destiny in that moment. And so I often think about what was going through Jesus' mind during this trial before Pilate as well. And and then there's this other part of the same. So we find Jesus reserved and silent, and yet we find this crowd gathering and growing and getting more and more angry, and even asking Pilate to release Barabbas, who's a known murderer, instead of Jesus. And when Pilate asks the crowd what to do with Jesus, they start yelling, "Crucify him!" And that's really a tough scene to think about. And again, my men's group this morning was asking, put yourself in the crowd. What would you have done? Would you have joined in? Or would you have walked away? Would you have stood up and argued that Jesus should be released instead of Barabbas? What would you have done? We've seen that kind of mob mentality recently here in our nation's capital in January. And it's a bit scary how that anger can grow within any of us, especially in a group setting like that, if we're not careful. And before we know it, there we are, maybe joining in something that we never thought we would do. So I have a feeling that probably was the case here for many of the people there, that maybe they didn't come there intending to join in on this angry mob and demand that Jesus be crucified, but that's where they found themselves by the end of that time. And so that's a really tough thing to think about, and to put ourselves in that story, and what would we do. But that's indeed what happened here, and we all know where things led after that, directly to a brutal beating and to the cross for Jesus. And so that's what we think about and reflect on Good Friday. And as I've been reflecting on that this week, this Holy Week, it's been a busy week around here for all of us on staff. And as I've been thinking about that and praying about that, one of the things that came to me was the movie Passion of the Christ. And I don't know if you watched that movie. It was a Mel Gibson movie years ago, decades ago now probably. But I remember the first time I'd ever watched the scene that we're talking about. I hadn't watched anything in the movie, but I was a youth pastor at the time, and or maybe I wasn't. I think I was actually a volunteer with the youth ministry at the time, and we went to an Acquire the Fire youth rally up in Denver, and we were in the Coliseum, and there's thousands of us in there, and they showed this clip that we read, that you'll read later in the scripture that we just read after Jesus gets beat. So they show this scene where he's getting whipped with metal and bone on the ends, that they're just ripping his flesh on his back and on his legs, and then he has to carry his own cross to Golgotha, and he's on his way to the cross, and there's this angry mob, and they're all shouting at him as he's walking through the streets to go to his death. And he ends up, in the movie, he ends up stumbling and falling and landing on the ground. And so they showed this scene at this Acquire the Fire, and so the volume is cranked up, and when he fell, you could feel it in your chest. You could literally feel that. And then eventually this man named Simon comes and helps Jesus carry his cross the rest of the way, because he's too weak to do it himself from the beating and stuff. But anyhow, that scene was shown. And that's the first time I had seen any scene from the Passion of the Christ. And it rocked my world. It just, I don't know, I immediately just started weeping, and one of the youth even came over and asked me if I was okay. because she was worried about me. I mean, I was just like, it had a profound impact on me because I had read that story many times over my life up to that point. But for whatever reason, seeing it played out on this big screen in this big Coliseum, with the volume and with everything that was going on, it was just powerful for me, and I'll never forget that moment. That Jesus's sacrifice for me became very, very real for me in that moment. But as painful as that story is to read or to see played out on film, as I was reflecting about that this week, this was really a necessary fulfillment of prophecy. The New Testament writers quoted or alluded to the words of Isaiah about the suffering servant more than any other Old Testament passage. They knew that this was what Jesus' the Messiah's destiny was. And so this had to be strongly on Mark's mind as he wrote about Jesus' trial and abuse and condemnation and eventual going to the cross and his death. It had to be on his mind. And so I would encourage you all, it's in the meditation moments as well, but I would encourage you all to read through Isaiah 52, verse 13, starting in Isaiah 52:13, and then through the whole chapter of 53. So Isaiah 52:13 through 53:12 paints a very vivid picture of the suffering servant, of Jesus paying for all of our sins. And so, like I said, Mark had to have been thinking about that as he's writing this part of his gospel. And I encourage you to read that before Easter, and especially today would be a great day to be reading through Isaiah's portrayal of the suffering servant as well. But as we close our time this morning, I wanted to turn back to the first part of our passage that we read, where Peter denies Jesus 3 times. And early Christian tradition claims that Mark wrote down the Apostle Peter's memories, and so it's really likely that Peter told this story himself to Mark, and Mark wrote it down as a way of offering his hearers and all of us to the experience that Peter had of forgiveness and a new hope that he had found in Jesus after this happened. So we, in Mark's gospel, we read about this probably low point in Peter's life. But there's a beautiful story in the end of John's gospel that I've always loved. It's always one of my favorites, and it's been even more profound to me and powerful to me recently, especially as we've done a lot of work with our Native Hope ministry. We've been doing family-to-family stuff and providing food for families on the reservation. This passage has taken even on more meaning for me, but I just wanted to spend our last bit of our time reading through this part of John's gospel and this encounter that Peter has with Jesus after Jesus rises from the grave. Because what we find is that Peter and the other disciples, after Jesus' death and burial, they find themselves lost. They find themselves not knowing what to do anymore. They're afraid. And so one day, Peter tells the rest of them, hey, I'm going to go fishing. I'm going to go back to what I know to do. I mean, he was a fisherman, and so he goes back to what's comfortable and what he's familiar with, because his world's been rocked after Jesus dies. And so they jump in the boat and they go out to the Sea of Galilee, and they go fishing for the night. And early in the morning, this takes place. So I'm going to read this to you in John's Gospel. We're going to read John 21, 1 through 17. It says, later Jesus appeared again to the disciples beside the Sea of Galilee. This is how it happened. Several of the disciples were there: Simon Peter, Thomas, nicknamed the twin, Nathanael from Cana in Galilee, the sons of Zebedee, and 2 other disciples. Simon Peter said, I'm going fishing. We'll come too, they all said. So they went out in the boat, but they caught nothing all night. At dawn, Jesus was standing on the beach, but the disciples couldn't see who he was. He called out, Fellows, have you caught any fish? No, they replied. Then he said, Throw out your net on the right-hand side of the boat, and you'll get some. So they did, and they couldn't haul in the net because there were so many fish in it. Then the disciple Jesus loved said to Peter, It's the Lord. When Simon Peter heard that it was the Lord, he put on his tunic, for he had stripped for work, jumped into the water, and headed to shore. The other stayed with the boat and pulled the loaded net to the shore, for they were only about 100 yards from shore. When they got there, they found breakfast waiting for them, fish cooking over a charcoal fire and some bread. Bring some of the fish you've caught, Jesus said. So Simon Peter went aboard and dragged the net to the shore. There were 153 large fish, and yet the net hadn't torn. Now come and have some breakfast, Jesus said. None of the disciples dared to ask him, Who are you? They knew it was the Lord. Then Jesus served them the bread and the fish. This was the 3rd time Jesus had appeared to his disciples since he had been raised from the dead. After breakfast, Jesus asked Simon Peter, Simon, son of John, do you love me more than these? Yes, Lord, Peter replied. You know I love you. Then feed my lambs, Jesus told him. Jesus repeated the question, Simon, son of John, do you love me? Yes, Lord, Peter said, you know I love you. Then take care of my sheep, Jesus said. A 3rd time he asked him, Simon, son of John, do you love me? Peter was hurt that Jesus asked the question a 3rd time. He said, Lord, you know everything. You know that I love you. Jesus said, then feed my sheep. And I love that story because in Mark's gospel, Peter denies Jesus 3 times. But in John's gospel, Jesus asked Peter the same exact question 3 different times. Peter, do you love me? And for me, right or wrong, it's as though Jesus, by asking Peter 3 times if he loves him, and Peter answering, yes, I love you, Jesus, all 3 times, that Jesus is giving Peter the opportunity to forgive himself for the 3 denials that he was part of before Jesus was crucified. And I don't know, I just think that's a beautiful story and a reminder to all of us that Jesus also offers us the same opportunities to show our love for him, even when we have at times failed and fallen short. So that's always been a powerful passage for me. I think it was the turning point that Peter needed, really. I think he was experiencing a lot of guilt, a lot of shame for what he had done and what he had said, and about his closest friend and his Lord and his Savior. And Jesus gave him this opportunity to experience not only Jesus's forgiveness, but for him to be able to forgive himself. And then Peter went on to become exactly what Jesus said he would as well, which was the rock, which was the cornerstone of building up this new church that we're a part of today, over 2,000 years later. So, a few questions to think about and reflect on over this Easter weekend and this Good Friday in particular. And so what are some ways that you have been or could be ashamed of Jesus in the pressures of your daily life? So like I said earlier, have you ever been in Peter's shoes? And what are some ways that you have maybe been ashamed or felt pressure to not portray that you're a Christian for whatever reason? Also, is there a difference between being ashamed of Jesus and being tactful or tolerant towards those who do not share your Christian faith? So, is there a difference? Are we ashamed of being labeled a follower of Jesus, or are we trying to not offend those who might have a different faith than us or might not have any faith at all? So there's kind of a fine line there. And so what are your thoughts on that? And how can we make sure we're not being ashamed of Jesus and actually standing up for our Christian faith and beliefs without maybe offending others who don't share that same faith. But I think sometimes we can use that as an excuse that, oh, we're trying to be politically correct, or we're trying not to offend anyone, so we just won't say anything. And I don't think that's what Jesus called us to do. He called us to stand up for our faith and for Him, but do it in the right way, that people can actually hear and respect, and not feel like you're judging them, but that you're sharing what you truly believe. Also, when have you said or done things that were aimed at satisfying the crowd? When have you said or done things that were aimed at satisfying the crowd? No, I've been guilty of that at times, of saying or doing something that to get approval from others, and instead of maybe trying to do what I should have done and getting approval from Jesus. And then the last question is, when have you remained silent when you should have spoken out? Obviously, there was people in that crowd that may not have joined in and said, crucify him, and joined the angry mob, so to speak, but they may have just remained silent and allowed the others to prevail and to do what ended up happening. And so, when have you remained silent when you should have spoken out about your faith in Jesus, or about anything else that regards your moral values or anything like that? So those are some good questions for us to be thinking about this Good Friday. We'll wrap up with our memory verse for this week, which is Mark 15:39. And it's, when the Roman officer who stood facing Jesus saw how he had died, he exclaimed, this man was truly the Son of God. This man was truly the Son of God. And so that's another powerful, for me, another powerful, example of why we can truly believe this story, as hard as it is to believe sometimes. This Roman officer who was, not a follower of Jesus, witnessed everything that happened that day and concluded himself that Jesus truly was the Son of God. And so that's a great memory verse for us to remember. That strengthens our faith, because there's so many instances in the scriptures that point to this truly happening. It wasn't just something that was written, it was something that happened, and it was real. It was real for people who followed Jesus and real for people who didn't. So I wanted to remind everybody that we are doing a Stations of the Cross labyrinth in our sanctuary today between noon and 3. So if you can make it here to the church doors will be open during those times. You can come in. It's just a quiet reflection where you walk around through the different Stations of the Cross, and you follow that path that Jesus took to the cross. It's a really powerful experience, and it's in our sanctuary for you to participate in. You can come anytime between noon and 3 today, and the doors will be open. And just be nice and quiet as you're walking through and reflecting, and do it at your own pace. And we hope you can do that. If you're not able to join us in person today for that, we also have an online version of the Stations of the Cross that you can find on our website. So encourage you to do that. Be a great way to enter into this final part of Holy Week. So as we go to Easter this weekend. So I hope you all have a blessed day this Good Friday and a happy Easter weekend. And we'll see you again in a couple of weeks. Rob will be on next Friday as usual. We flip-flop each week. But until then, hope you all are doing well. Get out and enjoy some good weather this weekend.